Welcome to A Splice of Life Science Marketing. I'm Jasmine Gria-Gray, and as always, I'm joined by Matt Wilkinson. Hey, Matt.
Hi.
So today, hacking what you can and can't say about research use only products, or sometimes that's abbreviated as RUO, and how to avoid tripping the FDA wires. Our guest today is Josh Levin. He has led post-market work at FDA's CDRH for molecular and pathology devices, focusing on compliance around RUO products and lab-developed testing, as well as working with firms on transitioning their CLIA quality systems to an FDA compliant system. He later drove quality system implementation at PGDX and diagnostics regulatory strategy at ASELL and GSK. Through Iron Line Consulting, he now advises labs and diagnostics teams on regulatory strategy and QMS. Prior to FDA, Josh worked at research product firms for 10 years, including a stint as director of R&D at KPL. Matt, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you so much. Now, Josh, research use only sounds pretty simple, but in 1 minute, what does it actually mean? And how does the FDA determine a product's intended use in practice versus the sort of totality of claims and context and not just considering this a disclaimer?
Sure. Well, thank you, Matt and Jasmine, for the opportunity to speak on this subject. So FDA views research use only as almost a diagnostic product that's in the developmental stage. That because the product is being developed, FDA understands that there might be kits that are being developed for the purposes of researchers to try and use in their research. But there's also an understanding that FDA quality system regulations don't apply at this stage, and the claims that companies can make around these products are very limited. Not sure I completely answered your question, but happy to elaborate further.
Oh, thank you for that. No, that was really useful.
So, what specific RUO statement has to appear where? And does punctuation, capitalization matter for ads, data sheets, and slide decks?
Yeah, so there's a standard statement which is defined in the FDA regulations, and there's actually a very useful FDA guidance on this. And the statement, I don't remember exactly, but it's something about for research use only, not for use in diagnostic procedures. And this is something that RUO companies should have on their labeling, just to make it very clear that they're not promoting the product for diagnostic use.
Yeah, I've often used this in companies where I've worked and seen it in many others. For example, on antibodies, on the label of the vial, it says research use only. So
Right.
that sort of covers it, does it?
Yes, I think we'll probably talk about how research use only manufacturers, tools manufacturers, can work with their partners who might be using the product in diagnostic applications, and what firms can do to protect themselves against FDA inspection or oversight.
That I can't wait to get into that. But before we do, what can a manufacturer say and not say about a research use only product? And maybe more importantly, is there a difference between written copy and verbal communications, or are both of those treated exactly the same?
That's a very good question, especially around the written and verbal communication. So companies, tools companies, or research use products companies are allowed to talk about the analytical capabilities of their product. So to give you an example, I had and that should be very transparent to the user. We had a company who we were investigating at FDA where the company had a combined score of 80 different biomarkers, and they were claiming this was a research use only tool. And we said, okay, well, what are the 80 markers? You need to disclose that to your customer and what the analytical performance is on each of those. And because they were unwilling to do that, we said, this is not a research tool you're marketing, this is a diagnostic, because of that lack of transparency. So tools companies should be very transparent about the analytical performance of their product on the particular marker. So, for example, if you have an antibody, being able to show Western blots or ELISA data or what have you on the performance of that antibody.
So that's really interesting. So you're allowed to talk about the analytical capabilities, and then
Mhm.
it's up to the user to go that extra step if they want to use it for diagnostic purposes. They have to then
That's
do the
correct.
proof in the lab developed test.
And this is where the difference between written and verbal communication comes in handy. So written communication is what FDA is going to scrutinize. And website copy, for example, is probably the most accessible medium to FDA, and where companies tend to get tripped up a lot because the website copy is often written by marketers. No offense. But there's a bit of a desire to overstate what that product can do. And be happy to share some suggestions for how to imply a diagnostic claim in written labeling. Um, in verbal communication, you have a lot more flexibility because a court has ruled, I don't remember the exact case, but there was a court ruling that FDA could not regulate freedom of speech. So, for example, if you have a salesperson saying something to the effect of, well, we know customers are using this in diagnostics. We're not supposed to be marketing it for that purpose, but you can do what you want with it. Something a statement like that, FDA can't control what a salesperson says. That being said, however, I definitely recommend training your sales staff very closely that they don't cross that particular line. And that, again, I think statements like the one I mentioned are ways you can kind of get around saying what you want to say without actually saying it.
Brilliant, and that's such a subtle distinction,
Mhm.
and I love that free speech comes in, even to a conversation about RUO. Brilliant.
Yeah.
So I'd love to go back to what you said earlier about how what's written, particularly in very public information like a website, can trip you up. What are some of the red flag words that you've seen in your experience? What is some safe phrasing? What kind of guidance would you give our audience?
So let's say that you had this antibody, and the antibody had a particular diagnostic use for I don't know, let's say prostate cancer, just to make something up. If in your website copy you were to say our product is useful in the diagnosis of prostate cancer or something like that, that could trip you up, and FDA could say you're making an implied claim. But if you said something like this antibody has been shown to be a useful marker in prostate cancer, and then you list literature references, then you're not saying it's your product. You're just saying that this is what the scientists say. So FDA can't or will be less willing to call you on that because you're not making a claim specifically about your product, but about this class of products and this particular biomarker.
Are there documents that can help researchers with this phrasing and with how to avoid making claims on diagnostic intent?
Happy to use the opportunity to promote Iron Line Consulting Services, where we certainly work with clients on this issue. And I'll give maybe another example that we worked on with a client, where the client's marketing department, they wanted to claim that they were interferent free for a particular interferent. And this was a diagnostic company, but they hadn't performed the testing. So we recommended that they use the language of interferent free by design rather than simply interferent free because we didn't want to imply that they had done the testing. So that's an example of where we can work with clients. I don't think there's anything specifically written. Again, the research use only guidance that FDA puts out is a good general guidance, but it doesn't necessarily talk about specific examples. Promote the use of a good regulatory consultant, even for tools firms, to help avoid that particular issue. And it's usually something we can solve fairly quickly.
That's got me thinking. I mean, I know the words can be interpreted in different ways, but so can data. So if I'm marketing an RUO product, I want to look at analytical performance and talk about some of the performance of the tool that I'm selling. I could imagine that even that data could actually imply clinical validity. So is there a way to ensure that you're framing that data in a way that isn't implying clinical or diagnostic validity, but is actually just sort of showing this is the analytical performance of the product?
Yes, certainly. And as you mentioned, Matt, it's a very subtle distinction. I think if you're clear that you're testing, you're doing retrospective testing on patient samples, for example. Like if you're not implying that this is part of a clinical study, it's especially useful if it's someone else's data, if you have like a research collaborator and then you're presenting that person's data. It can be a very subtle distinction. So you do want to make sure that the language really avoids any implication that it's a diagnostic tool, that it start with the thought that this is a research tool and you're showing research data in support of your research clients. I think you'll be in good shape if you kind of look at it that way. I think firms get into trouble where they try to be cute, and they know they have diagnostic customers. And again, happy to get into how you might actually work with a diagnostic customer.
I'd love to do that.
Mm-hmm.
To sort of just to dig into sort of something that made me think of there, which was if I was to have a product, you look at some retrospective samples. Then if I look at a correlation between the analytical capabilities of my tool and my test, and shall we say the diagnosis of
Mm-hmm.
condition, is that then implying that it can be used as a diagnostic, or am I actually just saying in this study we showed a great correlation between the analytical capabilities and diagnosis?
I think that you do want to be careful there. I think saying it, if it's sort of like put in a research frame of mind that we took patients with prostate cancer, we measured them, and our antibody showed that X% had this marker. As long as you're not going out and implying with your data that people can then use this product directly for diagnosis, but kind of the goal of the study is a research goal, and that it's put in that context. I think that's kind of the mindset to have in mind. But it can be very subtle, because a lot of these tools obviously are of interest for diagnostic purposes as well.
So as you probably know, Josh, a very common tactic in the RUO space is to have application notes, case studies, whether it's from a key customer or a key opinion leader. Are there any guardrails around applying these success stories or these application notes? And any disclaimers that need to be included in the messaging?
I would again promote the use of a good regulatory consultant to screen the language. But I think keeping to the same mindset that you're putting out an application note as a research tool. If you were putting it out for diagnostic purposes, you wouldn't be a tools company anymore. I think if it's written by a third party, I think you're a little safer there because it's the third party's opinion. If, for example, that third party, the KOL, was to say, I think this product could be useful in the diagnosis of XYZ, that's their opinion, and you may get away with that. It's often a little difficult to know what FDA is going to pick on, because oftentimes FDA gets told about things by competitors. What's the risk of putting that language in your documentation, and how important is it to you? That's what you really have to balance.
Do you think that AI will actually have an impact on what the FDA finds out, that they no longer rely on information from competitors, but they actually go searching out for these misses themselves?
So, Jasmine, I think you've given FDA a great idea, because, as you know, FDA is very resource strained at the moment, and there's been, as you can imagine, a brain drain from FDA, especially in the diagnostic group, and they're really struggling to get good people. So they have, even when I was there, we had very limited resources to do compliance. So AI could really potentially help a lot there. FDA's tried to use AI, not entirely successfully, in the review process, but I think the fact that they took a step in that direction indicates that your idea might not be too far off about them using AI for compliance. It could actually be very effective there as a screening tool that would be later vetted by humans.
You mentioned earlier sort of looking about how RUO companies can maybe work with diagnostics or clinical labs. If I'm selling RUO product and my sale, I get a request from somebody in a clinical lab, how do I handle it if I learn a customer is using an RUO product diagnostically? Is there anything I need to say or do or behave differently if it's obviously an academic lab versus if it's actually a clinical lab that is using an RUO product in maybe a lab developed test or something like that?
Matt, that's a good question. As you know, this is an area I'm very passionate about. I've been in kind of all sides of that. As director of R&D at KPL, we were balancing the needs of our research customers and our diagnostic customers. Then again at FDA, and then at PGDX, the diagnostic company. So I can speak to my experiences at a tool company at KPL, and there we knew who our customers were and what they were doing with it. So we would put the disclaimer in very big letters. Now it was a little different because we sold antibodies for food detection, salmonella and listeria, and things like that. Well, it was FDA regulated, but not in the same way diagnostics is. But with diagnostic companies, sometimes they would come to us and say, "Well, we need you to be GMP," and we would say, "No, we're not going to do that." But we're ISO 9001. You take it or leave it. And then they would come in and do an audit and satisfy themselves and then leave. So we knew what they were doing. They knew what we were doing. And our attitude was, whatever you guys want to do with the product, that's on you. We're selling it for research. You want to make it into a diagnostic, have fun. Try not to make any bones about us being a diagnostic company. And that was one of the reasons for not going to full GMP with our production. At PGDX, we were selling our product as kind of for beta testing or alpha testing. We did have to train our sales staff. I remember a meeting where they put up a list of our customers for the RUO product, and they had clinical. And so we made them take that off. So don't put that on a slide. That's discoverable. We are going to get FDA inspected at some point. And well, with lab developed tests, that's a whole nother situation. And when I was at FDA, we were actively trying to get a handle on lab developed tests by going after tools manufacturers. And you can see this with a couple of recent warning letters. We actually have a blog post about a warning letter that was sent to Agena Diagnostics. Well, first of all, the name of the company makes it sound like a diagnostic company. So, okay, there's that. But they had an RUO product where they were making very explicit diagnostic claims, and FDA called them on that. And then when FDA showed up for an inspection, the quality manager just didn't handle it very well. So they weren't really prepared to deal with that kind of question. So they got a warning letter. And there have been a couple examples like that. We did put a lot of effort into trying to find some use cases when I was at FDA, and it was very difficult to prove intent. So what I would recommend to the tools company is imagine getting inspected by FDA and think about how you would handle that and make sure your documentation and more importantly, your quality people are well equipped to handle a kind of visit from FDA, because it can happen.
That's really interesting. So in terms of being able to, you wouldn't necessarily go down the GMP route. So there's actually almost things from a business perspective to avoid, to almost protect yourself from saying, "Hey, we're a diagnostics company." There's clearly some language that you've just told us that you have to be really careful of. It still feels like there's a large sort of gray space that you have to operate in to be really successful here.
That's true. I would say that some tools companies do go to the effort of creating GMP products, and they'll tell the IVD customers, in vitro diagnostic customers, do you want the GMP product or the regular product? Because FDA is very clear on that component suppliers to an in vitro diagnostic do not have to be GMP. So for example, if you're making that antibody and you're selling it to a diagnostic company, you're not required to be under GMP. But there is a lot of gray space in that we, FDA, knew that these tools manufacturers knew who they were selling to. And the laboratory developed test situation, which we could talk for another hour about, is another reason why FDA would like to get a handle on research use only products, because they've been told by a court they can't go after lab developed tests. So that then gives FDA the incentive to move backward into the supply chain to try to get some control over these diagnostic tests, which laboratory developed tests not cleared or approved by FDA make up probably 99% of the diagnostic testing market. So 1% of the diagnostic tests are actually FDA regulated. And so FDA would like to get some sort of handle on this if they could. And that does put tools companies under the microscope a bit.
That's almost frightening that whatever the lab says they are, where's the accountability in that?
So the lab position on this is that they're regulated by CLIA regulations. Our position at FDA was that CLIA does a very good job of regulating the laboratory operations and making sure that patient results are not, say, switched, for example, which is a very important thing. So, you send a sample into Quest or LabCorp, and you want to make sure that test result is yours. And CLIA does a very good job on that. Where we, FDA, felt that CLIA wasn't doing a particularly good job was on the test validation. So the requirements are very weak on what constitutes a validated test. And not to go into some detail, but New York State actually has some more sophisticated requirements. But to make a long story short, FDA doesn't believe that CLIA is adequate for assuring a validation of a diagnostic test. But the labs disagree. And many of the big labs actually do have very good validation programs. They're very sophisticated. FDA's approach was, well, we're not worried about you big labs. We're worried about the fact that anybody can do this. So there's been a debate for many years to which the labs currently have the upper hand, both because of the court case. And because, frankly, the labs, FDA has mentioned, doesn't have a lot of people left who can really speak to this issue. Most of us have gone to industry where we feel like we can, honestly, we feel like we can do a lot more good by helping companies work with FDA.
So, if we can pivot a little bit on the business side of things, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
many tool companies use distributors. What compliance language belongs in a distributor agreement? What kind of marketing approvals and partner training is typical to prevent off-label promotion of an RUO product by a distributor?
So I do have to admit this is an area where I don't have a large amount of knowledge. But speaking from the regulatory side, or when I was in a research products company working on the R&D side, it would be, scrutinizing, making sure we had the ability, treating that distributor as a supplier and making sure we had adequate supplier controls. We had the ability to scrutinize their language. We had the ability to audit them, for example. Putting those things into place. And the tools companies I worked with were ISO 9001 certified, which is a good way to build a quality system that lets you perform those kinds of supplier related tasks. So I kind of turned my answer into a quality regulatory answer, which I probably didn't fully answer your question, but some of that I have less experience with the contracting side.
Oh, I think what you said makes perfect sense. Auditing your
Mm-hmm.
distributors, having some kind of approval process
Mm-hmm.
to review the documentation before it goes public, to review their website language before it goes
Yeah.
public.
Absolutely. I think treating them like a supplier, like you would handle your critical suppliers that way. At least I'd hope tools companies do that. They're obviously not required to, but the supply chain is a very important piece of these products.
Absolutely.
Just sort of keeping on that sort of supply chain, but maybe sort of looking at usage again.
Mm-hmm.
If an RUO reagent runs on an instrument also used clinically, or your analysis software outputs a report that could be perceived to be patient-like, what marketing lines can't be crossed before you trigger this sort of the IVD requirement?
Yeah, so this is a great question, Matt. And FDA actually has a guidance on instruments with combined functions. So if you think about like an Illumina sequencer, for example, or PCR device, those can be used both in IVD and RUO environments. And FDA wants to make sure the instrument manufacturer has a way to carve that out, in order that the instrument isn't going to report out RUO data in a clinical environment. So, for example, if you're selling that product, if you're an instrument manufacturer like an Illumina or Bio-Rad or whoever makes the PCR device, you're selling an instrument into a clinical laboratory. You're able to keep from that reporting. It is complicated somewhat by the laboratory developed test situation, but FDA does have a guidance on how you as an instrument manufacturer can appropriately close off certain functions for diagnostic customers.
And what sort of functions would those be, just so that I can understand them a bit?
I'll give an example from next generation sequencing, which is probably the technology I'm most familiar with. With a lot of these tests, there's a limited number of variants that the system can report in diagnosis mode. So if you're using, but of course, next generation sequencing, you can report out an infinite number of variants for research purposes. So FDA will want to help have the instrument designed that if it's being run in diagnostic mode, that only those variants can be reported out. In fact, there's a couple of approvals where FDA went further and tiered the analytes in terms of how much evidence there was around that particular marker. So some had very clear clinical data associated with them, some only analytical data, and some were more preliminary.
That's really interesting, and I love the example because you've got me thinking about some work I used to do with with the software company that essentially created a software as a service to be able to look at genomic data, and it's being used by the NHS, and so it is in some ways you'd call it a diagnostic product, but it's when it was focused on rare disease, and often rare disease we don't have diagnostic markers yet. We have variants of interest, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost impossible to get it validated as a diagnostic instrument in its tool in its entirety, because what you actually want to do is, okay, we've got these markers, as you say, that could be reported out as a diagnosis, but everything else could actually be something of interest, where they are variants of interest, where actually if we get enough data, we might be able to one day say these are diagnostic of this particular rare disease.
And that's correct. There are 4 companies who've gotten approval under pre-market approval for their next generation sequencing system. I mean, in addition to Illumina that has a clearance for the instrument, but those 4 companies were asked by FDA to come up with a plan for how they were going to continue to monitor variants and update their test as more information became available from the variants. And to be fair to clinical labs that are doing next generation sequencing, especially the good ones, are doing this all the time. They're also updating their knowledge base.
Yeah, no, it's so important, and it's getting that right balance between being able to help a patient with a diagnosis and actually also being able to continue to further knowledge about what are many times are underserved and understudied diseases.
No, absolutely, and this is one of the areas where the line between research use only and in vitro diagnostics is very tenuous. And at FDA, we were very interested in this because there's obviously there were a lot of companies offering sequencing services, and then there were other companies, as you mentioned, Matt, offering the software. So labs were able to put 2 and 2 together and come up with a next generation sequencing oncology diagnostic. We were at FDA a little concerned about how to deal with that particular situation. And again, I think given that laboratory developed tests are no longer under FDA peer review, that effort has at the moment, it's not a priority of FDA, but that's something to look for. They look at companies combining different RUO components to make an in vitro diagnostic, which is completely legitimate if they're bringing that diagnostic through FDA. Again, as I mentioned before, there's nothing wrong with having research use only components in your in vitro diagnostic, as long as you go to FDA with it.
So, to round out our discussion today, which has been fantastic, and it's just surfaced how complex this topic is, but to put you on the spot a little bit, are there 3 tips you can give to tools companies about getting into the diagnostic space?
Well, that's a great question, Jasmine. So, first of all, I would say go in with your eyes wide open. And again, I'll give you a brief plug for what Iron Line Consulting does. So we look at 4 elements: the science behind it, which presumably is there if the tools company has been doing good science all along; the commercial goals, which are very important; and what is, as a company, maybe this is one of the 3 tips I'll give us as a tools company, what is your goal in getting into the diagnostic space, and really understanding that. And then the other question is, what diagnostic do you want to develop and why? We often see companies coming to us with great technologies, and we ask them what they want to do with it. And what disease do you want to look at? Because when you develop a diagnostic, you have to have that disease expertise on your team to understand how customers are going to use your product. So I think that would be one, is understanding the commercial space. And maybe I'll say 4 tips, counting the good science, because that becomes even more critical as you go to validation under a diagnostic realm. Then your quality system is very important. As I mentioned, we think it's best practices for tools companies to be under ISO 9001. That's not always possible, but it's a good general practice. But then how do you elevate that from that to the medical device quality system, which is ISO 1345, which is a lot more explicit around the design process and is tied into risk management and things like that. So that is kind of a step up that tools companies need to take. And I'll give an example of something that happened during the COVID era. I was working at a diagnostic company at the time, Acel, and we wanted to partner with a little tools company that had this really cool technology. And they said they could run their assay in 2 hours. And I said, how's that possible, given all the steps you have in your assay? So they invited me over to see them. And I said, okay, I get how you're doing it in 2 hours. You're not documenting anything. Where in a medical device company, you're writing everything down when you run that assay, where they were not even lab notes. This wasn't even best practices. But anyhow, so quality system, I think, is the third. And then regulatory engagement. What's your strategy around engaging with FDA? We recommend something called the pre-submission, which is usually a really good way to engage with FDA and doesn't cost any money. And it's a good way for companies to toe into the water with FDA and get an idea about what the validation requirements might be and what the regulatory pathway might be. So I think those are the areas we would look at. That's a great question. I think tools companies are often afraid to take that leap.
It's a big commitment, both financial as well as culturally. Really, really appreciate all your insights today. Thank you so much for joining us on A Splice of Life Science Marketing.
And thank you both. I enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate the opportunity.